be very, very carefully laid out.
The novelist Ian McEwan once said that all readers have to at some point contend with the awkward fact that some of the nicest people they know have never read a book.
Right. Well, okay. So let's go into the IQ thing more terribly. So IQ tests produce ethnic differences, and then you might say, well, that constitutes a sign of bias. It's like, okay, if that was true, then IQ tests would when you're using them to predict real life performance within groups, they would underpredict the real life performance of the ethnic groups where IQ scores are lower, but they don't. So there's no evidence of bias in terms of prediction. Now you could say, well, that means the whole system is rigged. The IQ system is rigged and the life outcome system is rigged. And that would be basically the position of the egalitarian left. It's like, fair enough, that could be the case. But there's another ugly thing that lurks here too, is, well, let's say that you decide that the way that you're going to deal with the fact that there are ethnic differences in IQ in the literature is that you're going to throw IQ out completely and not bother with it. And sometimes universities are starting to do this because they're throwing away tests like the SAT. And people say that these standardized tests are not IQ tests, but that's because they don't know what the hell they're talking about. Because they are absolutely and clearly IQ tests. Because any test that tests a reasonable set of questions of abstraction that you get a total score from or an average is an IQ test. So people can wave their hands about that all they want, but that just means they don't know what the hell they're talking about. All right, so let's say we decide just to scrap the idea of IQ. Well, here's a problem. As our society, this is actually a problem that Charles Murray and Herrnstein talked about in the bell curve. It was never really mentioned, though, because it's actually an argument that the left should be very sensitive to. We are producing our hierarchies are increasingly IQ predicated. Yes. And so what's happening is that the dispossessed that the left hypothetically is concerned about and genuinely concerned about, to the degree that there's genuine and proper engagement on the left, because it's the proper role of the left, is that if you don't take differences in cognitive function into account, you are going to miss what's going to dispossess most people over the next 30 or 40 years, because we're producing a cognitive hierarchy. And increasingly, the spoils of the hierarchy are going to people who are in the cognitive stratosphere, so to speak, especially because it's one thing to be really smart. It gives you an edge in a complex society, especially one that's changing very rapidly like ours. But if you're really smart and you know how to use a computer, you are so far ahead of people that it's like you're a member of a different species. And if you don't think that that's going to be the fundamental problem of the coming age, let's say, then you're not very awake.
I suppose just to wrap up this issue for the time being, the thing I've been trying to work out my own disturbance about this issue for a while, and I suppose I recently managed to hone it down to this, that it's not that I think that it should be ignored, I don't think it can be denied, but that I suppose one of the things that makes me so uncomfortable about the IQ thing is that I can foresee, if the people who are most interested in it keep pushing it like this, I see some terrible concatenation of nightmares, because of course this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's also, in my view, happening at a point when, let me put it this way, the concept of the sanctity of the individual, whether you define that in a religious context or in the kind of secular religious context in which some of us currently hold this idea, at the time in which the notion of the sanctity of the individual is sort of eroding in a society, the combination of that happening at the same time as an obsession with IQ in the century ahead of us just has the potential for a catastrophe of 20th century proportions. And that's the reason why I just fear that if this isn't dealt with in a reasonable way, it comes at us in the most unreasonable way imaginable somewhere down the line.
Well, I think that that's a genuine concern, that there's going to be elements of it that are going to come at us in an unreasonable way. I mean, look at what's happened at Harvard. Yeah. One of the things that's happened there, and the Asians, of course, are the wild card in this whole enterprise, because the affirmative action policies in the U.S. hypothetically were set up, at least in part, to bring minority so-called minority, it's not like Asians are a minority, but to bring minority people
Access
up
to the university.
Sure, but it turns out that if you use unbiased selection processes, then you overselect for Asians. So you overselect for Asians and Jews. It's like, oh my God.
Which is why they're now discovering that Harvard's had to come up with these techniques to try to downgrade Asians, such as downgrading them on
personality.
Personality.
Well, and the funny thing too is it's not that they're downgrading them on personality, because they don't use objective personality measures, which they could use. Because one of the things that's really cool about the Big Five, especially measures of conscientiousness, is measures of conscientiousness do not produce ethnic differences. So one of the ways of putting together a selection battery that's objective, let's say, which would mean both blind to peripheral characteristics such as race, but also capable of predicting the desired outcomes. So that's what I mean by objective, is to produce a battery of tests that blends cognitive assessment with genuine personality assessment. And actually, it's so interesting because in the American context, you're actually bound to do that by law if you're selecting employees, because you're bound to use the most valid and reliable current method of selection. That's instantiated into law. And the American Psychological Association has stated firmly that the proper way to do that is to use a balance of cognitive tests and personality tests. But virtually no one does that for all sorts of extremely complicated and absurd reasons. But then you might say, well, we can't use the cognitive tests because they produce ethnic differences, and you can moderate that by interleaving personality, which is one way of dealing with it. We're going to use something else. It's like, okay, you're going to use something else. Well, it turns out that whatever else you use is more biased than the thing you're fleeing from. And that's what's manifesting itself at Harvard. Well, we'll use our subjective judgment. And, the Harvard people have been hand-waving about the fact that their bloody admission criteria are so sophisticated that you can't capture them with mere quantitative analysis.
This is their latest one after trying to just make sure nobody had access to what they were actually doing.
That's right. We're so sophisticated that we couldn't possibly quantify it. It's like, that's not sophisticated. That's prejudice.
At every single stage, Harvard University in this case, that Asian students have brought, at every single stage, they've done everything they can to cover over the actual fact that they are themselves being biased on ethnic reasons in their selection.
Well,
it's an extraordinary sight.
Sure, and so what's happening is that wherever subjectivity is allowed to enter into the equation, the Asians are downgraded as a consequence of personality, which isn't personality. It's actually the subjective sense that the evaluators produce when they read through the applications and they know that the applicant is Asian.
And it wasn't even, without even meeting the applicant. Judging the person on racial characteristics without having met them.
Yes, and there's a variety of things that are appalling about that. And one of them, of course, is the denial of the opportunity to attend a top-tier university like Harvard for the students who were qualified to attend, the Asian students. But there's another element to this that's also equally pernicious and in some sense more self-serving. Like, if you set up your society properly, and this is the equality of opportunity doctrine, it's in everyone's best interest to exploit the talented maximally, right? Because in every domain of productive endeavor, a small proportion of people do most of the productive work. And so you want to take advantage of those people, those 1 in 1,000 people or 1 in 10,000 people who are mathematically gifted, for example, or gifted in whatever way they happen to be gifted. And so if you don't select your top tier candidates, so let's say the Asian students in the case of Harvard, then society doesn't get a chance to exploit them properly and everyone ends up poorer. Apart from the fact that each individual doesn't get their opportunity, there's a social cost here too that's not trivial. And then, of course, the other issue is that the criteria are seen to be inequitable, because they actually are. And that produces a terrible amount of cynicism about the institutions themselves. So the horror of objective testing is that it's biased. Yes. And that the more profound horror is that no matter what you replace it with something that's even more biased. So it's like, well, good luck thinking your way out of that conundrum.
Wow, wow, wow. That was an absolutely fascinating conversation with Jordan Peterson answering the question, talking about IQ tests, subjective, objective, personality tests. Then they brought what was happening with the Harvard. We all know that the Asian students sued Harvard for reverse discrimination. And the whole idea, affirmative action by the left, was never intended. It was intended for minorities, is what they were talking about. But what the minorities that they were talking about were the black minorities. And so the affirmative action to allow, Africa, to allow black people to attend some of these highly elite colleges, even though they didn't have the meritocracy to enter them. They didn't have the scores, they didn't have the grades, they didn't score well on these tests. But they said that's just not fair. So we have to have representation of blacks at these universities. Otherwise, it's going to be all white dominated. But that's what it was. So now you had this reverse discrimination. So you've always heard it that white students have said, well, I had the exact same score, or I didn't get in, or I had a higher score and I didn't get into that. And I know for a fact that that person scored less than I did on the standardized test. How did he happen to get in? What happened there? And now along come the Asians and the Jewish people, and all of a sudden they start dominating on meritocracy. And then you say, well, we just can't have. I mean, what would be wrong if, for example, if Harvard came out and said, you know what, we have 90% Asians over here, we have 7% white, and we have 3% black and Latinos and everybody else. Meritocracy, that's fine. You scored well, but as Jordan Peterson talks about, that by allowing these biases to occur through these subjective tests, which they call personality tests. And the only way they found this thing out was because when they were reading the papers and finding out that it was linked to an Asian student, if you just gave a number assigned to that essay and there was no indication of who that person was, what name that was from, I guarantee you the amount of people who would be coming into these universities and colleges. Oh my, it would be completely turned around. You would have such a higher number of Asians and foreign students inside there because now the people that are looking at the tests, the right until the interview process, the person that's there looking at all these resumes, all they can go upon is the score and the writing, and that's it. Now, there might be something in the writing that obviously the person saying where their hometown was or where they were born or where they were raised or things that they've done. There might be some clues in it where this person is coming from. But other than that, all things being equal, they would basically say, yep, you know what? The student's here. But no, Asian students were basically saying that we are being discriminated against on these subjective personality tests, knocking our scores down, giving higher scores to blacks and other minorities, allowing them to take our place. And that's just, and for Harvard and these other ones, this is a huge embarrassment, obviously huge. So, and then Jordan Peterson talks about, and I thought this was just the way that he phrased it, that basically take advantage, exploit the intelligent people, for society to exploit the intelligent people. Because if you don't exploit them for what they know, their knowledge, how is society going to grow and prosper? They're the ones that are going to be doing the inventions. They're going to be the ones doing the innovating. They're the ones that are going to be bringing new technologies and new means in the workplace, all kinds of things. So if you don't exploit them for the good of society, and you don't allow them to enter these elite institutions so that they can hone their skills and become even more intelligent, if that's what you're thinking of, then you are actually subtracting from society what the left basically said that they're trying to do to uplift the the classes, the masses, because the left is just a bunch of asses. Anyways, folks, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Sheikh Show. I've been your host. My name is Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel. If you feel that the content is what you like, you know what to do. Like, share, and follow us. Check out our links above and below. My final thought, as always, when you're right, and when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.